all of this, I had been basically gaslighting myself and telling myself that it was all related to being like recently postpartum. And I knew it wasn't my period and I knew it wasn't childbirth, but I still like wasn't yet like, it really wasn't until they told me like you have cancer. I mean, I still am shocked about it. I am a mom of two kids, Amira, who is 4.5, and Mona, who is 7.5. I live in Oakland, California, and I have a dog, and I'm a knitter, and I'm the executive director of Bright Spot Network, which supports families where a parent has a cancer diagnosis. So in 2018, I had my daughter, Amira. I was 37. I had her in April 2018. And, I had a really normal pregnancy, pretty normal birth, like all of that kind of stuff. But throughout my pregnancy with her, I was just really constipated. And I had like stomach pains. And, I was pregnant. So like wasn't super like atypical or anything like that. And then after I had her, it got really bad, but I was nursing and I was probably dehydrated, like all these things that were really able to explain away, like the constipation that had become like actually like pretty like, debilitating in my life. And then finally, like my husband was like, you don't have to live this way, like go to the doctor, and then I get there and I'm just like telling my doctor, like I'm constipated. And, so he right, gives me some like stuff for that. But I'm also like, and I'm also like a little short of breath and I've been really tired. Things that I had been just like, all of this, I had been basically gaslighting myself and telling myself that it was all related to being like recently postpartum. And thankfully my doctor didn't. And he was like, let's just get you some blood work. And so I went and got my blood work. And I'll say that like I felt so, I don't know, I didn't feel good, but I did not feel sick. That like if like the blood work hadn't been like covered by my insurance, like I wouldn't have gotten it. Like I know 100%, like if it had been a fee, like I wouldn't have gotten it, but it was covered by my insurance. And so, I got the blood work, and then in the middle of the night, the next day or at 5 a.m., my doctor, or, the hospital called me, the lab called me and was like, don't get in a car, don't drive, like you are anemic. We don't know kind of like how you're sort of standing on 2 feet. I mean, I think that like really what snapped me out of it was the anemia that they found from the blood work. I mean, I think that when my doctor was like, let's get blood work, it made me feel like, okay, like maybe there is something else here. And like I said, I felt like I was gaslighting myself. Like I felt like I was like, of course I'm tired, I'm a new mom, like all this kind of stuff, but like not really recognizing how like deeply fatigued I was, and that it all just felt like, especially I think for parents, and I think especially for women, like there's this like, this like extra, I think both internally that we put on ourselves that like we can do all of these things, like we can be a full-time, employee at a really kind of like intense job and be, like nursing in the middle of the night and pumping at work and, just doing all this stuff that like, it was easy to write off the like tiredness, and that blood work, ultimately saved my life. So, it's pretty stark. Anyway, and so then I finally talked to a doctor and they were like, right now, like you need to go get a blood transfusion, like, and they were like, and, like, let me reiterate that, like, we are unsure how you are like walking on your 2 feet, like, so anyway, so at that point, I went to I was in urgent care because it was a Saturday, and I went to go get the blood transfusion. And then when I went in, that really, like, I think was, it was like the getting the lab was the beginning of, what set everything in motion, but really the blood transfusion, because I saw how concerned the doctors were about this anemia. And that's what happened for me, is basically like, I went in for the blood transfusion. I had this like low grade fever and the doctors couldn't really figure it out. And then that kind of like alerted me to like how serious everything really was. I mean, I would just say like, listen to your body. It's clearly not what I was doing. And I really wish I had. I think that like, I ended up seeing a lot of doctors during those, I think it was because I couldn't get it, because it's hard to get a colonoscopy if you're not like, if it's not an immediate thing. It's not hard, but it took me a few weeks to get like on the schedule. I think that I was signed up for it pretty early on, but like in that, in the meantime, I was like seeing other doctors, but at that point it was sort of like, this is where people were just kind of like running through the possible scenarios, and I knew it wasn't my period and I knew it wasn't childbirth, but I still like wasn't yet like, it really wasn't until they told me like, you have cancer. I mean, I still am shocked about it, like, I mean, I think a lot of cancer, survivors and patients feel that. I mean, I just want to say that I feel like people are really scared of a colonoscopy because, you have the prep, it's not comfortable. Like the idea of a colonoscopy, I think makes folks, squeamish. I just want to say it is so not a big deal when it comes down to it. It's so important. Colonoscopies are one of the most effective ways to find colon cancer. And also, I'll just say that, now they've changed the screening age to 45. I mean, so after my colonoscopy, they were able to tell me immediately that they thought that I had cancer. So, they saw what was like a bleeding tumor in my colon, and that was the anemia. That was the cause of the anemia. And yeah, I mean, then things started to move really fast. My mom died from breast cancer. So, I mean, I will say that like having cancer like in my family, like I was like shocked, but not surprised to hear about the cancer, if that like makes sense. Yeah, so things started moving really fast. The next day I got a CT scan. But I will say that like, in the weeks and months and, years really since that time, that like, I really thought that I knew what cancer could like do to a family. Cause like I was 16 when my mom was diagnosed and 25 when she died. But it is like, it's different, to be like the patient, and it's also different to have little kids. And like, there's just like a different level of anxiety, I think, that I have now, regarding like my kids and cancer, regarding, just like people around me. I think also just like, I think a lot about, like how my relationship in, now, like since she's died, has actually like changed with her, if that makes sense. Like, kind of like we have a shared experience that we didn't have before. It was really like like I just like want to talk to her about her experience, like now, like I went with her to get chemo. Like, yeah, I just like wanted to talk to her about it and like talk to her about her own feelings, or like she knit my kids things. I wanted to talk to her about it. Like these like things I just like wanted to like dig in with her. So right after the colonoscopy, I got set up with a CT scan, which I had the next day. And the CT scan basically confirmed the cancer, but the CT scan still can't stage anything. I met with my oncologist. I think, I mean, like the timeline's a little hazy here, but basically from the CT scan, they were able to like say, like, this is the surgery that we think you need. And it might look a little different, but this is what we think you'll need. And where my cancer was, determined ultimately, it was like where it is on the colon determines ultimately like what type of surgery you have, or if you need some sort of like ostomy or other type of kind of assisted technology. I didn't end up needing an ostomy, but like now that I know a lot about colon cancer, and that like I know a lot about people who go in for like a hemicolectomy and come out with something like, like that, like the cancer looked a little different and that the doctor needed to make a decision. I do wish somebody had like just told me that was, so that means definitely something that if you are going in for some sort of like colon cancer type of surgery, it might be something that's worth asking your doctor, is like the likelihood of like coming out of the surgery with a temporary or permanent ostomy. So for me, that wasn't true. And like, but my surgeon did tell me that there would be like changes to my bowels. And I think partly probably because of my age, that did happen, but I was able, like our colons are amazing. And it was able to like pretty, I don't know, within, I would say, I mean, it's hard because then I had chemotherapy. So I would say like, things evened out, I guess is the way I would describe it. That probably the hardest thing like was getting out of bed that first, the first time the nurse tried to like help me out of bed. Like that was maybe like the hardest like 3 minutes of my life, was like that kind of getting out of bed. And I had, the surgery was laparoscopic, but they do like a pretty major incision to like remove the like tumor. But I'm really thankful to that nurse who was just like encouraging me every step of the way, because I really credit like being able to walk around the hospital with like a pretty easy recovery from the surgery. So my understanding is that for colon cancer, not stage 4, for under stage 4, the standard of care is like pretty like well respected. And so, the option that I had was between the two different types of chemo. And my doctor gave me the one, or he was I'm not sure if he was encouraging, but he was kind of encouraging me to do the one that had like the harder side effects. So that like, if that was harder for me, I'd be always able to like go to to the other chemo that is still super brutal, but like, just like the, some of the side effects are a little bit easier on your body. So that was the main, but even there, the, effectiveness of both of those chemos are like pretty, similar. Yeah. And I went with K-Pox. Mm-hmm. And the other reason I went with K-Pox is because FOLFOX, you get a like a chemo bag that, or it's not a chemo pump that is like on your body for 24 hours. And just for my family, it just felt like if there was an option where I didn't have the chemo, like on my body, it was just better for my family in terms of like having little kids and like, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So it was the oxaliplatin was the infusion, and the capecitabine, it's like an oral pill, Xeloda. And so I took that for, it was a 3 weeks on with it was a 3-week, cycle. So I would get the infusion and start the chemo pills on the first day of the cycle. And then after, I would have 2 weeks of pills and then have a week off and then start again. I would say that the worst for me was nausea. I didn't throw up a lot, but I was like very, very nauseous. And for me, the nausea like always was worse when I wasn't eating. And chemo did not make me want to eat anything. So then the nausea got worse. And so then it was like this really kind of like vicious cycle. This was a place where I didn't really advocate for myself. Whatever anti-nausea I was on, it like, I think that, I don't know if other people experience this, but I think that I almost associated it with the nausea, if that makes sense, because I would take it at the beginning of my chemo cycle. And so it was very like, it was like I don't know, it was like a psychosomatic response to like that pill was like, anyway, so it was a place where I didn't advocate for myself enough to ask my doctor if there was other types of anti-nausea. I will say that I was taking a like a THC tincture that was like not psychoactive. It was a tincture. I mean, I don't know, but it was basically like a tincture that had, I don't know, what they told me was that it had sort of like helped to like isolate the munchies. And so I would take that and it would help my hunger. Also for me, like, again, like walking was really helpful. I experienced like pretty serious neuropathy. So it was in my feet and my hands, but also like just like kind of like muscle So for colon cancer, you're, if they're able to get all of the cancer out during your surgery, you're declared NED at the day of surgery. So because the cancer was so advanced, they do the chemo as like a cleanup chemo, kind of assuming that there's cancer still in your body, because so many of my lymph nodes had been infected and the cancer had been like so deep into my colon. They're kind of like making the assumption that like there's probably cancer elsewhere in your body. But I think I got another CT scan after my last chemo, or a month after my last chemo. So my doctor really early on was like, we're going to try to get you into this clinical trial. So it was a clinical trial that was to ward off recurrence. It's a really big trial. But in terms of the clinical trial, my last chemo, I had a clinical trial nurse approach me about it to kind of like, I think that's like maybe when I signed initial paperwork to kind of get enrolled. And then pretty soon after my very last chemo, I think maybe after that like scan, I started receiving pills that I took every day for 3 years. And then in addition to that, it was I forget all the details, but I think it was like every 3 months, quarterly blood work, and then meeting with my doctor periodically, just, virtual appointments, and then periodically, a little bit more frequently, meeting him in person. And I'm still on the trial, even though I'm no longer taking the pills. So I'm still enrolled, doing like research, like questionnaires, and then also continuing to do the blood work has slowed down as well as the appointments, but I'm still continuing to communicate with, the team. After my cancer diagnosis, anytime anybody would ask me anything about the future, I'd be like, let's just keep our fingers and toes crossed. But they were just like, yeah, you're going to be enrolled in this for 8 years. And so, so I have 5. So now I have 4 more years of, and at this point, it's just very, it's very low touch. But those first 3 years, I felt like I was meeting with the clinical trial nurse like every day, but it wasn't quite that intense. And for me, like, unfortunately, like my cancer experience and of my family is like, we have a lot of cancer in our family, and my mom, my aunt, my grandma, like everybody died. And so for me, like the idea of like surviving cancer is like a pretty, like, I don't, that's just like that's not the story that I know. And of course now it's different. Like now I know, now that feels more, now I know a lot of people survive cancer, but at the time, it didn't feel that way. I really remember being at work and having like this like a team meeting where we were encouraged to like write down where we hope to be professionally in 5 years. And I really was just like waterwork, like I was just like, I literally just like, I hope I don't die. So I think that like my experience for I had really, really good medical, care, but like, despite their best efforts, the like other, the social workers who were so helpful in so many ways, they really couldn't tell me like how to, so they were really unable to like point me to like resources for me as like a new parent who was navigating this experience and navigating it for my kids, because, as we know, like being a cancer patient doesn't just happen to the patient. It's the whole family, the whole community that's being affected. And so if you're a parent of little kids, then like kids are being affected too. And so for me, I wasn't able to find the resources. And to be fair, it's not that they didn't exist, but like they existed like on a breast cancer website, or like this website or that website. And like, I did not have the wherewithal to go. I'm a colon cancer patient. Like, I don't have the wherewithal to go to a breast cancer website or this website or that website, and like, and that made the like very terrifying experience of being a young cancer patient, like a really alienating one as well. And that's so true for like young adult cancer patients, like in general. And so that was just like, my kind of entrance into that alienation, I guess. But then I had a nutritionist connect me to another new mom with cancer, Amy Barnes. And me and Amy became friends. And so we became fast friends. And we reflected a lot how there wasn't resources for parents who were navigating a cancer diagnosis, even though we know that this is like a key part of the cancer patient experience for young parents. And so, I don't know, it was like over tacos, me and Amy were like, let's let's do this. And then like a month later, Amy was like, I filed the 501c3 paperwork. And I was like, really? And then from there, Bright Spot Network was launched. At Bright Spot Network, we work with parents who are diagnosed with cancer while raising young kids or diagnosed while pregnant. We focus on families with kids 0 to 6, and we have a bunch of programs. Some are really for parents, like support groups. So we have virtual support groups for parents in active treatment, parents in long-term survivorship, parents with stage 4 cancer, and for partners of parents with cancer. And so those are monthly, and then we periodically offer weekly groups. You know, like so much of my cancer experience was really impacted by being a parent. And one of the things that I knew instinctively when I was going through it, but I've learned now professionally, is how important it is to talk to your kids about your cancer diagnosis. You might think that they're too young to understand, but they understand that something's happening in your family, and telling them, walking them through the journey is going to be helpful. It's going to be helpful to them, and it's also going to be helpful to you. Your kids are making up a story in their head. And if you're able to like help them understand what's really happening in like age appropriate ways, you can go to our website for advice about this, but that's going to ultimately help them and help you. So it's really about like just, you know, welcoming them into the process the same way that you're like maybe perhaps welcoming other community members into your experience through helping them, you know, through helping in other ways. So it's really, you know, talking to your kids.